Hey guys, welcome back, and today we're going to go over the Bone Necro. This build absolutely surprised me, and now it's one of my favorite builds in the game. The single target damage it puts out is second to none. If you sometimes wish you didn't have to cast an ability twice to end the enemy, well, this is the build for you. It will clear elites, it'll clear bosses, and it'll even clear the Butcher in the blink of an eye. So let's dive into the Bone Crow, and yes, this build is 100% endgame viable. As always, I'm going to start with the skills, then I'm going to jump into the rotation, the gear, the aspects, and everything else you need to know for the build. Also, there's going to be a written guide linked down in the description below so that you can use that to put the build together once you understand it. The nice thing about this build is it's incredibly easy to play. It's not complicated. It's very intuitive. We're going to click our Bone Spear. Things are going to die. There's a couple of other things at play here that we'll talk about as we go over the skills, but it's actually a really easy build to play. Maybe one of the easiest I've played so far this season, just because of how simple and straightforward and intuitive it is. So let's dive in. The first thing we're going to grab is Bone Splinters. Bone Splinters is just our basic attack. It's mostly just here to help us generate resources when we need to accelerate that process. We're going to grab Enhanced Bone Splinter, which is going to cause it to fire 2 additional projectiles if it's cast over 50 essence. Next, for our core ability, what we're going to grab is Bone Spear. Bone Spear is going to be our bread and butter. This is putting out all of our damage, and it's going to put out a lot of damage. This is the thing that you'll see pass through a boss and kill it. And if it doesn't kill it on the way through, it'll probably kill it when it bounces and comes back. Same with elites, same with the Butcher, right? This thing is going to melt enemies, and it's absolutely hilarious when it does. And you'll really see the difference between the damage you're putting out and the damage the other people are putting out when you are at public events. And you'll see 3 or 4 people beating on an elite, and you'll walk up and delete it with a single shot. And if you're the first one to the next elite, it'll die before anybody else gets there. This happens all the time when I'm running around legions. I walk up, I cast my Bone Spear once, and it just one-shots the elite that the whole group was about to fight. Sometimes we need a quick break from the dark and gritty world of Diablo 4. When that happens, Wizard 101 is the perfect game to try and is the sponsor of today's video. Wizard 101 is free to play and is a classic MMORPG with tons of fun, strategic, turn-based combat for you to sit down and relax in. In Wizard 101, players will take on the role of student wizards who must save the world. You'll battle enemies by casting spells using a variety of different weapons. It's an incredibly unique combat system that allows you to collect new spells to become more powerful. As the player progresses through the game, they'll unlock more worlds and more power. But that's not all you can do. You can train pets, you can fish, garden, and craft. You can even decorate your house. If you're looking for a fun MMORPG with a great story and tons to do, download Wizard 101 using my link in the description right now. It's free, so you have nothing to lose by trying it. Join over 50 million wizards to hone your inner magic and help save the spiral in this nostalgic turn-based card collecting MMORPG. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the video. Feels good, man. By the end, we're going to max Bone Spear out. We're going to put as many points into this as we can, and we're going to get as many additional points from our gear as we can. We're going to take Enhanced Bone Spear, of course. This is going to make it break into 3 shards. When it's destroyed, dealing more damage with each one. So like when it hits the wall and bounces back, or when it hits at the end of its line and then it bounces back, right? These are doing more damage. And then we're going to take Supernatural Bone Spear. This is going to make the first enemy it hits vulnerable. We're going to have an aspect on our gear that makes the rest of the enemies it hits vulnerable. So all the enemies are going to be vulnerable, and we are going to stack extra vulnerable damage like crazy. So that's part of why we are going to melt enemies the way that we do. We're also going to grab Hued Flesh. This is going to be used for one of our aspects. It's going to be used for crowd controlling mobs, right? This is going to feel real good. It's basically going to create corpses while we're fighting enemies. And in the event that we're fighting a boss, let's say you get to the end of a dungeon and there's just one boss standing there and it's you and him and there's no corpses around, well, this is going to make sure that you're able to make a corpse so that you can fire off some of your other abilities that rely on corpses that really amplify our damage. Now we have Unliving Energy, another passive we're going to take. This is going to increase our max essence by 9. This is really important. This build wants as much essence as possible because of our key passive, which says the more essence we have, the more damage we do. So we want to have as much essence as possible at all times. And this is 9 extra essence. We're also going to get extra essence on our gear when we can. We're also going to get it on our Paragon board when we can. And that's going to be part of why we do so much damage with this build. We're going to grab Imperfectly Balanced. This is going to make our core skills cost 9 more essence, but do 15% more damage. So that's a good ratio of damage to cost right there. We're getting more damage than it's costing us, which is good, right? So we're taking that, we're maxing it out. Then we're going to come down here to our Corpse Macabre skills, and we're just going to take Blood Mist. And we're only going to put 1 point in Blood Mist. We don't care about the passives. This is just our CC break if we're in a pinch, if we get crowd controlled, if we get surrounded by enemies, and we need a way to escape that, right? Every build needs 1 crowd control break, or you're just asking to die, especially in Diablo 4. So this is that ability. This is our get out of jail free card when we need it. And we're also going to take Grim Harvest. We're only going to take 1 point of Grim Harvest right now because we're not actually consuming a ton of corpses in quick succession by any means. We're actually only using them as we absolutely need to because Bone Spear is doing all of our damage. Feel free while you're leveling up to use Corpse Explosion with your Bone Spear and put 3 points into this just while you're leveling. 3 points into Grim Harvest and a bunch of points into your Corpse Explosion. And for a long time, Corpse Explosion will carry during the leveling process. You'll know when it stops carrying. You'll start blowing up corpses and it's not really killing anything anymore like it used to, like one-shot everything, right? That's when it's time to spec back out a Corpse Explosion if you decided to use it for a little bit while leveling up. Next, we have Curse skills. We're going to be using Iron Maiden, which might sound a little bit weird, but it's actually for the fact that we don't actually care what the ability does. We're only using it for the first passive here. No longer costs essence. Instead, we gain 5 essence for every enemy cursed. Does not work with enemies who are already cursed. So as we're running through a dungeon, if we're not at full mana before we cast our Bone Spear, what we'll do is we will throw Iron Maiden on the group of enemies. There's 5, 10 enemies standing there, and boom, that's going to fill our mana back up, or our essence as it's called on the Necro, which as you now know makes us do more damage, right? If we cast our ability at full essence, it does way more damage than if we cast our ability at low essence, right? So you always want to be riding like the full, right? You want to be riding full of essence. You don't want to be running around on empty because then your skills are hitting like wet noodles compared to when you're full on essence. So it's better to cast less. It's better to be full before you engage your enemy than to be empty by a long shot. The next passive is kind of optional. It just says that heals for 5% of your max life when an enemy dies while afflicted with Iron Maiden. Well, we're going to be afflicting pretty much all the enemies with this. So this is a constant 5% heal coming in whenever we're killing enemies. It's a nice heal. It's a nice supplemental heal for free. You know, the 5% is a lot of health coming back in for killing these enemies. And since we're casting it on them anyway, we might as well get this nice passive healing out of it. Works out really well. We're going to take the passive amplify damage, which says you deal 9% increased damage to cursed enemies. Since we're cursing our enemies, why not take this free 9% damage? We're also going to take Death's Reach. You deal 12% increased damage to distant enemies. Well, you know, our Bone Spear travels a long way, and a lot of times we're going to throw it into a pack of mobs well before we get to them because the Necro is kind of a glass cannon, especially in the early levels. You'll feel like you're a little bit of a glass cannon. There's a lot of things we're going to do to fix that so that you're one tanky son of a gun by the end of it. But until then, you know, we're going to try to keep our distance from the enemies as best we can. In the next set of Corpse and Macabre skills, we're going to grab Corpse Tendrils. And Corpse Tendrils is a nice one to get extra points in from gear because it's going to cut the cooldown down. Right now, Corpse Tendrils on this build is down to a 7.5 second cooldown, which means we can cast this every 7.5 seconds. It's going to crowd control the entire room. We're also going to take Serration. This says our bone skills have a 0.9% increased critical strike chance for each 10 essence we have upon cast. We're always going to have a ton of essence when we cast. So this is going to be a solid increase in crit chance. We're going to take Compound Fracture. After critically striking 10 times with bone skills, our bone skills are going to deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. Well, mine is 30%. Normally it'll be 15% without the extra points. I've got some extra points for this on my amulet, which feels pretty good. And then finally we have Evulsion. Our bone skills are going to deal 18% increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Just one of many vulnerable amplifications that we're going to be rocking here. Next, finally, our ultimate skills. We're going to take Bone Storm. We're going to take this for a couple of reasons. One, this is a bone crow. We're using a bone for our basic attack. We're using bone for our core ability, and we're using a bone for our ultimate, right? So we're boning everything with this build. And part of the reason we're taking this is our damage reduction is increased by 15% while this is active. So it's making us considerably more tanky and much, much, much more tanky when we throw on one of the aspects that we're going to combine with this ability, which is going to give us massive shields constantly while it's active. So the way it turns out is while our Bone Storm's up, we're basically unkillable. But Bone Storm isn't just defensive though. It's also doing damage to the enemies enemies around us, and it's giving us critical strike chance increase by 20% while it's active. So it's a really nice, well-rounded ultimate because it's giving us defense and it's giving us offense. So we pop this when we're going to town on a boss or a pack of elites, and not only are we less likely to die, but we are also doing more damage. And the way we're getting those passives for Bone Storm is from these two passives that are attached to it. Prime Bone Storm is giving us the 15% damage reduction, and Supreme Bone Storm is giving us the critical strike chance. And then last but not least is Ossified Essence. Now this is an incredibly powerful key passive. It says our bone skills are dealing 1% increased damage for each point of essence we have above 50 upon cast. Right now we have 153 essence. We could certainly have more if we had slightly better rolls on some of our gear, but that means our skills are doing over 100% increased damage. So they are doing double damage, right? Just from the essence that we have when we cast the ability, nothing else. Before anything else is factored, they're just doubled in damage. So Ossified Essence is going to be doing a lot of work for us. Now that covers the abilities and the passives. Let's talk about the rotation real quick. What you're going to do is you're going to oftentimes fire a bone spear through the pack of enemies. This is going to create at least one corpse. Then you're going to corpse tendril that pack of enemies if the whole thing isn't dead already. By the way, a lot of times the rotation ends there. One bone spear, everything's dead, right? And you keep running to the next thing. But if it's an especially thick pack, or for some reason it doesn't all die, or you need the crowd control or the extra damage, after that you'll follow with a corpse tendril. This will group everything that's remaining up into a nice pack for you, and this is going to increase your damage thanks to an aspect. Our damage is going to be greatly amplified after using corpse tendrils on a corpse. Now that they're tightly packed up, we're going to use bone spear. If we get to the next pack and we're not full on essence, that's when we'll drop the Iron Maiden on them. You can also drop the Iron Maiden on them if you are full on essence, because it does give you that 9% increased damage. So feel free to do that if you want to. That leaves Blood Mist and Bone Storm. Basically, you're going to say Bone Storm for especially hairy looking fights. You walk up and you see maybe 3 elites standing there, or an elite with a bubble that forces you to get up close to it. That's a great time to pop your Bone Storm and then run in there and engage that elite with your Bone Storm. This is going to make it so that you can't die, right? This is your, I'm basically unkillable for the next 10 seconds. The ability does have a 1 minute cooldown or so. So, you know, you're going to want to use this strategically when you need to, when things are getting hairy, or when you have an especially difficult fight ahead of you and you need the increased damage mitigation and the increased damage. Blood Mist, of course, you're just going to save this. You get stunned, boom. Now you get out of that stun, right? Because the Necro is especially limited on their mobility abilities, and you'll definitely notice that on this Necro, especially if you've come from another class that zips around a little bit faster with some mobility abilities. You'll feel a little bit vulnerable out there with no mobility abilities, but you do have Blood Mist to help you if you do get caught. Now let's talk about the gear and the aspects that we're going to take. So for the helmet, you could use Deathless Visage. This is a unique, but this is by no means required for this build. In fact, if I was actually fighting a really hard boss, I would take this off and put on something that was leaning more into defenses. This is going to cause your Bone Spear to leave a trail of explosions behind it. So it'll zip by, and then there'll be these little orbs that explode after a short while. If something does survive the Bone Spear, a lot of times the trail of echoes this leaves behind will finish them off. For the chest piece, I'm running the Bone Storm aspect. This is going to cause our Bone Storm to give us a 5% shield, right? 5% of our health as a shield every time it hits the enemy for 10 seconds. So this is part of why when our Bone Shield's up and active and hitting things, we're unkillable, right? The Bone Storm is making us take less damage, and this is giving us a shield equal to 5% of our health for every enemy that it damages. That's a lot of shields, and that's a lot of not dying that we're doing there. On the gloves, I've got the Ossified Essence key passive aspect, which is going to make it so that our Ossified Essence increases the critical strike damage of our skills by 1% per essence above 50, up to 40%. So we basically always have an extra 40% crit damage with this passive. When the Bone Spear crits, it crits hard. As you'll notice, standing here unbuffed right now, I have a 42% crit chance, and I have a 272% crit damage. That's not including the critical strike damage with bone ability specifically, which is adding another 82% on top of that 272%, right? Much damage happening here. Our pants we're using very defensively again, because remember, the Necro is very glass cannony. You want to have at least 3 defensive aspects on. So here we've got, you gain increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal damage of any form to an enemy. This is a must-have aspect. In my opinion, there is no build that shouldn't use this aspect in the game right now. Armor is so valuable as a defensive mechanic, and this gives you a ton of armor. Put this on every build. and we're going to use it on the Necro for the same reason. On the boots, we're using Become Injured while crowd controlled grants you unstoppable for 4 seconds. Like I mentioned earlier, Necro kind of lacks on mobility, and so eventually you're going to get caught and you're going to get stunned, and your blood mist does have a 20-second cooldown. So in an especially hairy dungeon, sometimes there's a lot of mobs with CC, and this is just automatically going to pop you out of that CC if you become injured, aka if you go below 35% health. It's going to free you from that, and this will be a lifesaver. This will save your life, I guarantee it. The only other thing you could use here is something a little bit more mobility based, where if you crit, you get increased move speed for 1 second, right? Which is nice, but it's not a lot of increased move speed. It doesn't last very long, so it's nice to have, but this will save your life. So you can use either one. It's up to you. On the weapon, we're going to be using the bone spear aspect. This says that our bone spear is going to make enemies hit after the first enemy vulnerable for 3 to 5 seconds. And it's going to cause our bone spear to do an increased 215% damage to vulnerable enemies. So everything's going to be vulnerable. The passive is making the first enemy vulnerable. This aspect is making every enemy after the first one vulnerable. So everything's vulnerable, and everything's taking 215% increased damage. That is a lot of increased vulnerable damage. 215% from this one item alone. Massive, absolutely massive. On the rings, I went with Lucky Hit, giving us a chance to generate essence when we hit vulnerable enemies. Everything we hit is vulnerable, and so we end up triggering this more often than we would expect, which feels great because essence sustain, not running out of essence, in other words, is going to be one of the harder parts of this build to get used to until you kind of get into the ebb and flow and you get into the habit of casting your Iron Maiden on the packs of enemies as you run up to them before you kill them, not after, and you get into that Paragon board where we have some points that give us essence back whenever we kill an enemy, which feels really good when we get to that point. But until we get to that point, essence sustain can be a little bit tough. On the other ring, we're going to use the increased critical strike chance for 6 seconds when we cast corpse tendrils. So whenever we cast our corpse tendrils, we get extra crit chance for 6 seconds, and we deal 45% bonus crit damage to the enemies that were affected by the corpse tendrils. So it's going to group the enemies up, or it's going to stun them, or it's going to hit them, right? We're going to have 10 to 20% increased crit chance, and we're going to have 30 to 60 increased crit damage. A nice damage buff we're getting from those corpse tendrils. And again, this last 6 seconds, our corpse tendrils has just over a 7-second cooldown, so we can have near 100% uptime on this buff. Now, for our gems, I highly recommend using a damage reduction while crowd controlled. That's the topazes, the yellow ones. Put that in all your gear. I have 1 ruby for extra health here. I'm not sure that it's making any kind of a difference. I put it there just to see if I could feel like, do I feel like I get a little bit of extra breathing room? I don't know. I would err on the side of increased damage reduction. Throw another topaz in there. That's what I'd recommend. On the weapon, we're going to use the emeralds for the increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. The vulnerable debuff is one of the hardest hitting damage multipliers in the game. Anytime we can get more of that, we will, especially if we have good uptime on vulnerable. Skulls give us armor, and armor, as I mentioned, is the strongest defensive stat in the game right now. You want as much of it as you can get. That's good to have. Now for the rest of the stats that we're going to be looking for on each piece of gear, and for the Paragon points and where to spend those, as well as what order to assign your skill points if you're following this build as you level up, check out the written guide linked in the description below. It has all those details spelled out for you 1 point at a time, and it has the Paragon board, it has the pieces of gear along with which aspects you should be looking for when you're in each zone and what dungeons those aspects are located in. Tons and tons of really helpful information for putting this build together to save you as much time as possible. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below, or swing by my Twitch stream over at twitch.tv/luckyghost. I'm probably there live right now, and I'd love to talk to you about Diablo. On top of that, if you watch my stream right now, you get free cosmetic drops, and if you give 2 subs, you get a mount. So feel free to take advantage of that if you want. I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I did, and if you're not sold on this build and maybe you want to try something else, be sure to check out the video popping up on screen right now for my Ice Shards build. This was my favorite build up until I made this one, and now I'm not so sure which one's my favorite. It's really hard, and I'm torn between the two. Until the next video, guys, I'll see you next time.